They signed the papers without me. My name was still on the co-op agreement. I want to start with that sentence, because for nearly a decade I poured every ordinary morning and countless exhausting harvest seasons into a vineyard my own parents had built, while my siblings, living comfortable distant lives, quietly decided, without ever consulting me, that the entire property should simply be sold to the highest bidder. I want to tell you exactly how I discovered this decision, and exactly what stopped it, before it could ever be finalized, because I think, if you've ever poured years of genuine physical labor into something only to learn other people were making decisions about its future, entirely behind your back, you already understand the particular, cold clarity that arrives once you finally see the actual paperwork for yourself. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the things we build with our own two hands, and the specific, documented proof that sometimes protects that work long after we ever imagined needing it. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Margot. I am 43 years old, and 3 months ago I discovered that my brother and sister had privately negotiated the sale of our family's vineyard to a large wine conglomerate, a deal they intended to finalize without ever formally discussing it with me. Despite my own decade of daily hands-on labor keeping this specific property not just surviving, but genuinely thriving, I want to tell you about our family's vineyard first, because I think understanding its actual history matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Our parents, Henri and Marguerite, purchased 60 acres of hillside land in wine country nearly 40 years ago, back when the region was still considerably less fashionable and considerably more affordable than it eventually became. They spent decades building Domaine Rousseau from essentially nothing, our father managing the actual viticulture while our mother handled the business side, the accounting, the distributor relationships, the slow, patient work of building a reputation for quality that eventually allowed their modest operation to become genuinely respected within the regional wine community. I remember, as a child, the specific texture of growing up on that land, the particular smell of the soil after rain, the rhythmic seasonal patterns that structured our entire family's calendar around bud break, flowering, veraison, and eventually harvest, each stage carrying its own specific anxieties and small triumphs that my father would discuss over dinner with the same careful attention other families might reserve for discussing a child's school performance. I remember riding alongside him on the old tractor before I was even old enough to properly steer it myself, and I remember my mother's small home office, papers spread across the kitchen table some evenings as she worked through distributor contracts, teaching me, without either of us fully realizing it at the time, the specific discipline that running an agricultural business genuinely requires. I want to tell you about my own relationship with this vineyard, because understanding my specific, deep connection to this land matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. I am the youngest of 3 children. My brother, Nathaniel, is 7 years older than me, and my sister, Camille, is 5 years older. Both of them left for college and never seriously considered returning to work the vineyard themselves. Nathaniel eventually becoming a corporate attorney in the city. Camille building a career in hospitality management that eventually took her to a different state entirely. I want to be honest about my own path, because I think understanding it matters for everything that eventually happened. I also left initially, studying enology at a respected university program, genuinely believing, at the time, that I wanted to build my own separate career somewhere else entirely, perhaps working for a larger, more established winery rather than returning to our own family's modest operation. I remember those early years after graduating working at a considerably larger, more prestigious winery, 2 states away, genuinely enjoying the technical, hands-on work while also feeling, increasingly, a specific kind of restlessness that I couldn't quite name at the time, a sense that the meticulous craft I was learning to practice somewhere else might feel more genuinely meaningful, applied towards something my own family had actually built, rather than simply another employer's established operation. I remember calling my parents more frequently during this period than perhaps was strictly necessary, asking detailed questions about our own vineyard's specific challenges that year, a curiosity I understood, even then, as something more than simple idle interest. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that eventually brought me back to Domaine Rousseau, because understanding this decision matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 10 years ago, our father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, a diagnosis that, while not immediately incapacitating, made clear that his ability to continue managing the vineyard's demanding physical labor would gradually diminish over the following years. I remember the specific phone call where my mother described this diagnosis to me, her voice carrying a particular controlled worry that I recognized, even over the phone, as considerably more significant than her usual practical, unflappable demeanor typically allowed. I remember standing in my small apartment kitchen at the winery where I was working at the time, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the specific, disorienting shock of realizing my father, a man whose steady, capable hands had always represented such fundamental stability throughout my entire life, was now facing a diagnosis that would gradually, permanently change the shape of his own daily capabilities. I remember asking my mother detailed questions about his prognosis, his current symptoms, and the specific timeline doctors had described for his likely progression, absorbing information I genuinely hadn't expected to need to process at that particular point in my own life. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made following this diagnosis, because it represents the actual beginning of everything that eventually happened regarding this vineyard's ownership and management. I made the decision, within a few months of learning about my father's diagnosis, to leave my position at the winery where I'd been working and return home to help manage Domaine Rousseau directly, understanding that our parents would need considerably more hands-on support than either Nathaniel or Camille, given their own established lives and careers elsewhere, would realistically be able to provide. I want to describe the specific conversation I had with our parents when I proposed this return, because it represents the beginning of the specific ownership arrangement that would eventually become so critically important years later. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with both my parents, explaining my intention to return home permanently, and I remember my father, despite his own diagnosis, immediately raising a specific practical concern. He told me that if I was going to dedicate my own career and labor to the vineyard's ongoing operation, this commitment needed to be formally, legally recognized, rather than simply an informal arrangement that could later become a source of confusion or dispute among his 3 children. I remember his exact words that evening, delivered with the same careful, deliberate precision he brought to every important decision throughout his life. He said, "Margot, I've watched too many family farms fall apart because everyone assumed goodwill alone would settle who owned what once the parents were gone. I won't let that happen to what your mother and I have built here." I remember feeling both genuinely moved by his foresight and slightly uncomfortable with the formality of the conversation, understanding even in that moment that this practical caution reflected a specific wisdom I hadn't yet fully learned to appreciate at my own relatively young age. I want to tell you about the specific legal structure my parents established at that time, because this structure would eventually become the single most important piece of evidence in everything that happened years later. My parents, working with their longtime family attorney, restructured the vineyard's ownership into a formal agricultural cooperative arrangement, a structure specifically chosen, their attorney explained, to allow for flexible, documented ownership stakes that could accommodate my own increasing involvement in day-to-day operations, separate from Nathaniel and Camille's more passive, inherited ownership interests. I want to describe the specific terms of this cooperative agreement because understanding its exact structure matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Under this agreement, formally filed with the state's Agricultural Cooperative Registry, I was designated as an active managing partner, holding a specific, documented 30% ownership stake in recognition of my ongoing labor and management responsibilities, while Nathaniel and Camille each retained a 25% stake as more passive, inherited partners, with our parents retaining the remaining 20% until their own eventual passing or formal transfer of that final stake. I want to tell you about the following decade of my life, because understanding the genuine, sustained labor I dedicated to this vineyard matters enormously for understanding exactly how significant the eventual attempted sale would become. I moved back home permanently 9 years ago, taking on increasingly substantial responsibility for the vineyard's daily viticulture as my father's condition gradually progressed, eventually managing nearly every aspect of the property's physical operation myself, from pruning schedules to harvest timing, to the countless small, exhausting decisions that determine whether a given vintage will genuinely succeed or simply prove adequate. I remember the specific texture of those early years back home, waking before dawn during growing season to check for frost damage, spending entire days walking the rows myself checking for signs of disease or pest pressure. Learning, gradually, alongside my father while he was still able to teach me directly, the countless small accumulated details that separate a genuinely excellent vintage from a merely acceptable one. I remember specific harvest seasons where I worked 18-hour days for weeks at a time, my hands permanently stained purple from great must, falling asleep some nights still in my work clothes, too exhausted to properly clean up before collapsing into bed. I remember, too, the specific satisfaction of watching our reputation gradually grow under my own increasing management, wine critics beginning to specifically mention Domaine Rousseau in regional publications, distributor relationships expanding into markets my parents had never quite managed to break into themselves, evidence, slowly accumulating over years, that my own dedication and gradually developing expertise were genuinely adding something meaningful to what my parents had originally built. I want to tell you about my father's eventual passing, because understanding this specific transition matters for everything that eventually happened regarding the vineyard's ownership. My father passed away 4 years ago, a gradual decline related to his Parkinson's diagnosis that, while genuinely difficult, at least gave our family time to prepare emotionally for his eventual loss. Following his death, his remaining ownership stake transferred, according to the original cooperative agreement's specific terms, equally among the three of us, adjusting my own ownership to approximately 36%, while Nathaniel and Camille's respective stakes each grew to approximately 32%. I remember his final months clearly, his once steady hands trembling too significantly to safely continue even the lighter tasks he'd insisted on maintaining for as long as possible. Our conversations increasingly focused on his careful, detailed instructions regarding specific vineyard blocks he wanted me to understand fully, as though he were determined to transfer every last piece of his accumulated knowledge before his own capacity to communicate it clearly enough diminished entirely. I remember sitting beside his bed during his final week, holding his hand, the same hand that had taught me to properly prune a vine decades earlier, now still and quiet in mine, and I remember understanding, in that specific moment, that whatever came next for this vineyard, I carried a responsibility toward his memory that extended considerably beyond simple financial ownership alone. I want to tell you about my mother's role following my father's death, because understanding her continued involvement matters for everything that eventually unfolded. My mother remained actively involved in the vineyard's business operations following my father's passing, continuing to manage accounting and distributor relationships from her own home, work she genuinely enjoyed, and that allowed her to remain meaningfully connected to the family legacy she and my father had spent decades building together. I want to tell you about my mother's own passing, because this final transition represents the specific moment when the vineyard's ownership structure became entirely divided among the three of us, setting the stage for everything that would eventually happen. My mother passed away 18 months ago, a sudden stroke that took her within days, considerably less time to prepare than we'd had with my father's more gradual decline. Following her death, her remaining ownership stake transferred equally among the three of us, adjusting my own ownership to approximately 43%. While Nathaniel and Camille's respective stakes each grew to approximately 28.5%. I remember the specific disorienting shock of that particular loss, having genuinely believed following my father's death that my mother's steady, capable presence would remain a fixed part of my daily life for many more years, given her own good health and considerable remaining vitality right up until that final sudden stroke. I remember the specific week following her passing, working through the vineyard's daily operations almost mechanically, my body continuing the familiar physical routines while my mind remained largely elsewhere, still struggling to process the sudden, complete absence of the woman who had taught me everything I knew about the business side of the operation she and my father had spent decades building together. I want to tell you about the following 18 months, because understanding the specific circumstances of this period matters enormously for understanding exactly how the attempted sale was able to develop without my knowledge. Following my mother's death, I found myself managing not just the vineyard's physical operations, which I had already been doing for years, but also the business administration my mother had previously handled, accounting, distributor relationships, the countless administrative details that keep any working business genuinely functional. I want to be honest that this expanded responsibility left me genuinely exhausted throughout most of this period, working considerably longer hours than even my already demanding schedule had previously required. I want to tell you about my relationship with Nathaniel and Camille during this specific period, because understanding this dynamic matters for everything that eventually happened. Both Nathaniel and Camille attended our mother's funeral, and both expressed, at the time, genuine appreciation for everything I continued doing to maintain the Vineyard's operations. But I want to be honest that following the funeral, their actual involvement in the property's ongoing management remained minimal. Occasional brief phone calls checking on general updates, but no substantive, ongoing engagement with the actual daily realities of running the business. I want to tell you about the specific circumstances that eventually led to my discovery of their private sale negotiations, because this discovery emerged during an entirely ordinary business matter that had nothing directly to do with any suspicion on my part. Approximately 3 months ago, I received a call from our Vineyard's longtime accountant, a careful, longtime family friend named Robert Chen who had handled our books for over 2 decades, asking whether I could clarify some unusual banking activity he'd noticed while preparing our quarterly financial statements. I remember taking that call while standing in one of our upper Vineyard blocks, checking on some recent irrigation repairs, the specific ordinary rhythm of my afternoon interrupted by Robert's careful, slightly puzzled tone, one I recognized immediately as different from his usual straightforward, business-focused manner. I remember him mentioning that he'd been doing this work for our family for over 20 years, and that something about these specific requests felt genuinely unusual enough that he wanted to check with me directly before proceeding any further with our quarterly filings. I want to describe this specific phone call because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. Robert explained that he had noticed several inquiries from our business's primary bank regarding what appeared to be preliminary documentation requests related to a significant property transaction, requests that had been initiated using our business's official letterhead and account information, but that he had no record of authorizing or preparing himself. I want to describe my reaction to learning this information because it represents the first genuine moment of confusion and concern in everything that eventually unfolded. I told Robert I had no knowledge of any such transaction or documentation requests, and I remember a specific, cold uncertainty settling over me as we discussed this together, both of us genuinely puzzled about what these preliminary requests might actually represent, given that I, as the Vineyard's primary operational manager, had initiated no such process myself. I want to tell you about the specific investigation I conducted following this phone call because understanding exactly how I approached uncovering the full truth matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted our bank directly, requesting clarification regarding these specific documentation requests, and I want to describe the specific conversation that followed, because it represents the moment everything I'd believed about my siblings' involvement in the Vineyard's affairs fundamentally shifted. The bank representative, after confirming my own identity and authorization to access this information, explained that these preliminary documentation requests had been initiated by Nathaniel, using his own legitimate access as a listed partner on the business's accounts, specifically requesting historical financial statements and property valuation documents typically required as part of due diligence for a significant property sale. I remember standing at my kitchen counter during this specific call, the bank representative's calm, professional voice explaining details that felt, in that moment, almost impossible to properly absorb. My own free hand gripping the counter's edge as though I needed some physical support against information that was rapidly reorganizing my entire understanding of what my siblings had apparently been doing over recent weeks without my knowledge. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail because it represents the actual moment I understood something considerably more significant than simple administrative confusion was actually occurring. I sat in my own kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, feeling a specific, disorienting shock as I understood that Nathaniel had apparently been gathering financial documentation specifically related to selling the Vineyard, a property I had dedicated nearly a decade of my own life to actively managing and growing. without ever once mentioning this possibility to me directly. I want to tell you about the specific steps I took following this discovery, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this situation further matters for the eventual resolution of this entire story. I contacted Nathaniel directly, explaining what I had learned from our bank and asking him, calmly but directly, to explain exactly what these documentation requests actually represented. I remember making this call from the same Upper Vineyard block where I'd originally received Robert's call, understanding, I think, some instinctive need to have this difficult conversation in the actual physical space whose future was apparently being quietly decided without me. I remember the specific quality of silence on Nathaniel's end of the line when I first raised the subject, a pause considerably longer than his usual quick, confident responses typically allowed, and I remember understanding, even before he said a single word, that whatever explanation was coming would not be a simple, innocent one. I want to describe Nathaniel's initial response, because understanding his specific reaction matters for everything that eventually unfolded. Nathaniel, after an initial pause that told me he recognized immediately what specific information I had discovered, explained that he and Camille had in fact been in preliminary discussions with a large wine conglomerate regarding a potential sale of the entire property, explaining that they had wanted to first determine whether such a sale was even realistically feasible before bringing the specific possibility to me, understanding, he said, how emotionally significant this decision would likely be for me, given my own extensive personal investment in the Vineyard's ongoing operation. I remember his voice carrying a specific, careful, measured quality throughout this explanation, the same tone I imagine he uses professionally when delivering difficult news to his own corporate clients. A tone that, while not overtly defensive, clearly reflected considerable preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. I remember feeling a specific, growing frustration listening to him explain this reasoning, understanding that whatever genuine consideration he claimed to be extending toward my emotional well-being, the actual practical effect had simply been excluding me entirely from a decision that would fundamentally determine my own professional and personal future. I want to describe my reaction to this explanation because I think understanding my genuine, immediate anger matters for understanding everything that eventually happened. I told Nathaniel directly that regardless of whatever consideration he claimed to be extending toward my emotional response, he and Camille had no legitimate authority to conduct due diligence or preliminary sale negotiations regarding a property I held a documented 43% ownership stake in, without my knowledge or explicit consent. I want to tell you about the specific details Nathaniel eventually revealed regarding how far these negotiations had actually progressed, because understanding the full scope of what had already occurred matters enormously for understanding exactly how serious this situation had actually become. Nathaniel explained, with increasing discomfort as our conversation continued, that these discussions had actually progressed considerably further than simple preliminary due diligence, that he and Camille had, in fact, reached a tentative agreement with the conglomerate regarding a specific sale price, and that formal documents were currently being prepared for what he described as a final signing scheduled within the following several weeks. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific timeline, because it represents the moment I understood exactly how urgent my own intervention had genuinely become. I felt, in that specific moment, a considerable escalation of the concern I'd already been experiencing, understanding that whatever informal, family-oriented framing Nathaniel was attempting to apply to this situation, he and Camille had actually progressed toward a legally binding, imminent transaction, one that would have required my own formal consent and signature to be genuinely legally valid, but that they had apparently either overlooked or deliberately hoped to circumvent. I want to tell you about the specific legal question I needed to urgently understand, because this question matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted an attorney immediately, a careful, experienced woman named Miss Alvarez who specialized specifically in agricultural business and property law, explaining the full situation and requesting urgent guidance regarding whether Nathaniel and Camille could legally complete this sale without my own explicit consent, given my documented 43% ownership stake in the property. I remember my first meeting with Miss Alvarez, held at her office 2 days after my initial confrontation with Nathaniel, bringing with me a folder containing our original cooperative agreement documents, which I had kept carefully preserved among my own personal records ever since my parents first established this structure years earlier. I remember her reviewing these documents with the same careful, methodical attention I imagine she brought to every client's situation, occasionally making notes, before finally looking up with an expression I recognized, with considerable relief, as genuine professional confidence rather than uncertainty. I want to tell you what Ms. Alvarez explained, because her guidance clarified something critically important I hadn't previously fully understood about the specific legal protections my parents' original cooperative agreement had actually established. She explained that under the specific terms of our state's agricultural cooperative regulations, any sale of cooperative property required unanimous consent from all documented partners holding an active ownership stake, meaning that regardless of whatever majority combined ownership Nathaniel and Camille held between them, their 61% combined stake did not legally authorize a sale without my own explicit, formal consent as the cooperative's largest individual partner. I want to describe learning this specific legal detail because it represents the moment I understood that whatever Nathaniel and Camille had been planning, their entire sale negotiation, regardless of how far it had progressed, could never actually be legally finalized without my own formal agreement. I felt upon learning this specific legal detail because it represents the moment I understood that whatever Nathaniel and Camille had been planning, their entire sale negotiation, regardless of how far it had progressed, could never actually be legally finalized without my own formal agreement. If the problem is considered to be effective, never mind in the specific legal detail. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with both Nathaniel and Camille together, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I requested a formal meeting with both of them, along with Ms. Alvarez present, to help navigate the legal and factual details, held at our own family's vineyard, rather than any neutral location, understanding that I wanted this conversation to unfold in the specific place whose future we were actually discussing. I remember arranging chairs on our own back porch for this specific meeting. The same porch where our parents used to sit together most evenings, watching the sunset over the vine rows. A location I chose deliberately, understanding that the physical presence of the actual land under discussion might help ground our conversation in something more concrete than the abstract financial figures Nathaniel and Camille had apparently been considering from their own respective distances. I remember Nathaniel and Camille both arriving separately, neither quite meeting my eyes as they took their seats, a visible discomfort that told me, even before we began speaking, that they understood exactly how seriously I had come to regard this entire situation. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this particular discovery had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. I began by asking Nathaniel and Camille to explain, fully and honestly, exactly how far their negotiations with this conglomerate had actually progressed, and exactly why they had chosen not to include me in these discussions from their very beginning. I want to describe Camille's response, because understanding her specific perspective matters considerably for the full resolution of this entire story. Camille explained, with what struck me as genuine, if uncomfortable, honesty, that she and Nathaniel had specifically worried that including me in these discussions from the beginning would result in an emotional, difficult conversation that might prevent any rational, business-focused consideration of the sale's actual financial merits, given how personally significant the vineyard's continued operation was to my own daily life and identity. I remember Camille's voice carrying a specific, careful defensiveness as she offered this explanation, her hands folded tightly in her lap, occasionally glancing toward Nathaniel as though seeking some silent confirmation that she was representing their shared reasoning accurately. She added after a brief pause that they had genuinely intended to bring the offer to me once they had a fully finalized agreement in hand, believing, she said, that presenting a complete, concrete proposal would ultimately prove easier for me to evaluate than an earlier, more speculative conversation about a possible sale that might never actually materialize. I want to tell you about my response to this specific explanation, because I think it matters for understanding the broader resolution this conversation eventually reached. I told Camille and Nathaniel directly that their assumption regarding my likely emotional reaction did not actually authorize them to bypass my legal ownership rights, regardless of how genuinely they may have believed this approach would ultimately prove more efficient or less contentious. I want to tell you about the specific financial details Nathaniel eventually shared regarding the proposed sale, because understanding these specific terms matters for understanding exactly what I was actually being asked to consider. Once I finally had the opportunity to properly evaluate this decision myself, the conglomerate had offered approximately $4.2 million for the entire 60-acre property, a figure that, divided according to our current ownership percentages, would have provided me with approximately $1.8 million from my own 43% stake. A genuinely significant sum that, I want to be honest, represented a legitimate, serious financial consideration regardless of my own emotional attachment to the vineyard's continued operation. I remember sitting with these specific numbers for the first time during that porch meeting, Nathaniel sliding a printed summary across the small table between us, and I remember genuinely appreciating, even amid my continued anger about the process, that the figures themselves represented a serious, credible offer, rather than any kind of lowball attempt to take advantage of my own emotional attachment to the property. I want to be honest that seeing this specific number in writing, $1.8 million, did give me genuine pause, understanding that dismissing this figure purely out of anger regarding how the offer had been pursued would not actually serve my own long-term financial interests if the underlying business case for selling was in fact genuinely sound. I want to describe my own careful consideration of this offer, because I think understanding my genuine, thoughtful decision-making process matters for the full, complete resolution of this entire story. I want to be honest that I did not immediately, reflexively reject this offer simply out of anger regarding how it had been pursued. I spent several weeks, following this initial confrontation, carefully considering the actual financial and personal implications of either accepting or declining this sale, understanding that my own genuine emotional connection to this property should not entirely override a reasonable, careful financial analysis of what selling might actually mean for my own future. I want to tell you about the specific factors I ultimately weighed during this consideration, because understanding this careful process matters for explaining my eventual decision. I considered the genuine, ongoing physical demands of continuing to manage 60 acres of vineyard largely independently, understanding that my own body, however currently capable, would not indefinitely sustain this level of demanding physical labor. I considered the significant financial security a payout of this magnitude could provide, potentially allowing me to pursue other opportunities without the constant, considerable financial risk inherent in agricultural operation. I also considered with genuine seriousness whether my own attachment to this specific property reflected a rational, considered choice about my actual future, or simply an emotional resistance to change that might not, upon careful reflection, actually serve my own long-term interests. I want to tell you about the decision I ultimately reached, because I think understanding my specific reasoning matters for the complete resolution of this story. I ultimately decided to decline the sale, not out of simple emotional attachment alone, but based on a careful, considered financial analysis that Ms. Alvarez helped me conduct, examining the vineyard's actual ongoing profitability under my own management, profitability that had grown considerably over the preceding several years as I had gradually improved various operational efficiencies and expanded our distribution into several new regional markets. I want to describe the specific financial reasoning behind this decision because I think it matters for understanding that my choice reflected careful analysis rather than simple sentiment alone. Working with Ms. Alvarez and an independent financial advisor, I calculated that the vineyard's current annual profitability, if maintained and modestly grown over the following decade, would likely generate returns for my own ownership stake considerably exceeding what a one-time payout from the proposed sale would provide, assuming I continued managing the property with the same dedication and improving efficiency I had already demonstrated over the preceding decade. I remember spending several long evenings with our financial advisor, a patient, detail-oriented man who walked me through detailed spreadsheets projecting various scenarios, some conservative, some more optimistic, all of them ultimately supporting the same fundamental conclusion that my continued ownership and management represented a genuinely sound financial choice, not simply an emotionally satisfying one. I remember the specific relief of seeing these numbers laid out so clearly, understanding that whatever decision I ultimately made, I could feel confident it reflected careful, considered analysis rather than either reckless sentiment or an overly cautious capitulation to my siblings' original plan. I want to tell you about the specific proposal I made to Nathaniel and Camille regarding the Vineyard's future, because understanding this proposal matters for the complete resolution this story eventually reached. I proposed, instead of the outright sale they had been pursuing, that I would formally buy out their combined ownership stakes over a structured, multi-year payment plan financed through a business loan against the property's demonstrated profitability, allowing them to receive substantial, guaranteed financial compensation for their own ownership interests while allowing me to retain full sole ownership and continued operation of the vineyard going forward. I remember presenting this specific proposal to Nathaniel and Camille with a printed financial summary Ms. Alvarez and my own financial advisor had helped me prepare, walking them through the specific loan terms, the projected payment schedule, and the underlying profitability projections that made this structure genuinely feasible rather than simply an emotional, unrealistic alternative to their original plan. I remember watching Nathaniel study these figures carefully, his own legal training evident in the careful, methodical way he reviewed each page before offering any response. And I remember a specific, cautious hope beginning to build in me as I watched his expression shift from initial skepticism towards something closer to genuine consideration. I want to describe Nathaniel and Camille's reaction to this alternative proposal, because understanding their eventual response matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Nathaniel, after reviewing the specific financial terms with his own independent legal counsel, ultimately agreed to this buyout arrangement, understanding that the structured payments, while requiring more patience than an immediate lump sum, actually provided a genuinely comparable total financial return to what the original sale would have offered. Camille required somewhat more time to consider this alternative, understanding, I think, that her own more immediate financial needs made a structured, multi-year payout somewhat less immediately appealing than the lump sum the original sale would have provided. But after several additional conversations, and after Ms. Alvarez helped negotiate slightly more favorable initial payment terms, specifically to help address Camille's more immediate financial priorities, she ultimately agreed to this arrangement as well. I remember one particular conversation with Camille, held over the phone several weeks after our initial porch meeting, where she finally explained more openly why the immediate lump sum had originally felt so necessary to her, describing some genuine financial pressures in her own life. A recent divorce settlement that had left her carrying more debt than she'd previously disclosed to either Nathaniel or myself. I remember feeling, listening to her explain this, a specific, unexpected softening in my own remaining anger, understanding that whatever legitimate frustration I still carried regarding how this entire situation had unfolded, Camille's own original urgency had emerged from genuine private struggles I hadn't fully appreciated until she finally chose to share them with me directly. We eventually restructured the initial payment terms specifically to provide her a somewhat larger upfront installment, an adjustment I was genuinely glad to make once I understood the actual circumstances behind her original preference for an immediate, complete payout. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several weeks removed from finalizing this buyout arrangement, with both my siblings. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through documented legal protections and careful financial negotiation. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine relief at finally securing full sole ownership of a property I have dedicated nearly a decade of my own life to building and improving, alongside real, ongoing sadness that my own siblings had been willing to pursue such a significant decision entirely behind my back, rather than including me, from the very beginning, in a conversation about our shared family legacy's actual future. My relationship with Nathaniel remains somewhat businesslike since this entire experience. our conversations now largely centered around the practical logistics of his ongoing buyout payments, rather than the warmer, if distant, sibling relationship we'd maintained previously. I want to be honest that I don't yet know whether we'll fully rebuild the trust this situation damaged, though I remain genuinely open to that possibility given enough time and consistent demonstrated good faith on both our parts. My relationship with Camille, somewhat unexpectedly, has actually grown warmer since her own honest disclosure regarding her private financial struggles. We speak more regularly now than we had in years prior to this entire situation, and I find myself, cautiously, beginning to trust that her original decision reflected genuine personal desperation rather than any calculated disregard for my own rights and contributions. I completed my final payment to Nathaniel just last month, formally securing my full, sole ownership of Domaine Rousseau, a milestone I marked quietly, alone, walking the vineyard's rows at dusk the evening the final paperwork was formally recorded, understanding, in that specific moment, that I had genuinely secured not just legal ownership, but the actual practical continuation of everything my parents had spent their own lives building. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Formal documented ownership structures matter enormously, even within families where trust and goodwill might seem, on the surface, sufficient to protect everyone's genuine interests. My parents' careful, deliberate decision to formally structure our vineyard's ownership as a legal cooperative, rather than relying on informal family understanding alone, ultimately provided the exact legal protection that prevented a sale I had never actually agreed to. Having funded the long in complete contrast of me, and sale I had never actually agreed to. Here's a second truth I have carried with me since this entire experience. People sometimes justify excluding us from significant decisions by convincing themselves they're protecting us from difficult emotions, rather than recognizing that this exclusion itself often causes considerably more harm than whatever difficult conversation they were originally trying to avoid. Nathaniel and Camille both genuinely believed, I think, that they were sparing me some difficult emotional confrontation. In practice, their approach caused a considerably deeper breach of trust than any honest, if uncomfortable, initial conversation ever would have. Here is a third truth. Genuine attachment to something we've built through years of dedicated labor deserves careful, honest examination rather than simple, reflexive dismissal as mere sentiment. I took the proposed sale seriously, conducting genuine financial analysis before ultimately declining it, understanding that my own emotional connection to this vineyard needed to be weighed against legitimate financial considerations rather than either blindly followed or dismissively overridden. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require punishing the people who wronged us to feel genuinely complete. I did not pursue any additional legal action against Nathaniel or Camille beyond formally asserting my own legitimate ownership rights. I chose, instead, to negotiate a resolution that provided them genuine fair compensation while allowing me to continue building the specific legacy I had already dedicated a decade of my own life toward developing. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully appreciate until walking those vineyard rows alone the evening I finalized my full ownership. Sometimes the deepest security a legal victory can offer isn't simply the practical outcome itself, but the specific, renewed confidence that the work we've genuinely poured ourselves into can withstand whatever unexpected challenges eventually arise to threaten it. Evidence that our own dedication was never actually as fragile or as easily dismissed as those who doubted it originally assumed. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who love us most carefully prepare protections for our future decades before we ever actually need them, understanding with remarkable foresight exactly what challenges we might eventually face. My parents' decision to formally structure our vineyard's ownership as a cooperative, made specifically to protect my own dedicated labor years before any dispute ever arose, ultimately provided the exact foundation that preserved everything they had spent their own lives building. That is my story. Nearly a decade of dedicated, exhausting labor, one accountant's routine question about unusual banking activity, and one carefully documented cooperative agreement that finally proved exactly why a sale I never agreed to could never actually be finalized without me. I think, sometimes, about that specific afternoon at our kitchen table, sitting with both my parents, my father raising his careful, practical concern about formally documenting my growing role in the vineyard's future. I don't think, at the time, any of us fully imagined exactly how significant that particular decision would eventually become. I think about how easily this entire situation could have unfolded so differently, had my parents simply relied on informal family trust rather than insisting on the specific, deliberate legal structure that ultimately protected everything I had built. I walk those same vineyard rows most mornings now, considerably more settled than I felt during those difficult weeks of discovery and negotiation, watching the current growing season progress with the same careful attention I've brought to this land for nearly a decade. I think about my parents often during these quiet mornings, understanding, more fully now than ever before, exactly how much careful, deliberate foresight went into everything they built here. Foresight that extended, it turns out, considerably beyond simply the vines and the soil themselves. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the things we build through years of genuine dedication deserve formal legal protection rather than simple trust alone, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time you discovered someone was making significant decisions about something you'd built, entirely without your knowledge or consent. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.